Alexander Morrison had everything money could buy. At 32, he stood atop a financial empire that spanned 3 continents, lived in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline, and drove cars that cost more than most people's homes. Yet despite all his wealth, his 12,000 square foot apartment felt emptier than an abandoned warehouse. He'd inherited Morrison Industries from his father 5 years ago, and in that time, he'd doubled its worth. But success had come at a price. His days blurred together in an endless stream of board meetings, conference calls, and black-tie events where everyone wanted something from him. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him and seen Alexander the man, rather than Alexander Morrison, the billionaire. That's why he barely noticed Elena Rodriguez at first. She was just another face among the rotating staff that kept his pristine world running smoothly. But Elena was different in ways he'd eventually come to understand. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that neither sought his approval nor cowered from his presence. She did her work efficiently, never lingered, and never asked for anything beyond her modest salary. What Alexander didn't know was that Elena was fighting a battle that made his corporate warfare look like child's play. Every morning, she dropped her 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, at a daycare that consumed nearly half her paycheck. Every night, she went home to a studio apartment in Queens where the radiator clanked and the neighbors upstairs seemed to move furniture at 2 a.m. She was alone, Sophie's father having disappeared the moment he learned Elena was pregnant, leaving her to navigate single motherhood in one of the world's most expensive cities. Elena never complained. She couldn't afford to. Jobs that paid enough to cover rent, food, and childcare were precious commodities, and Alexander Morrison's household salary was the best she'd ever earned. So she cleaned his marble floors, organized his walk-in closets, and pretended not to notice the loneliness that hung in his apartment like expensive cologne. Everything changed on a Tuesday in November. Elena had been working for Alexander for 8 months, and in that time, they'd exchanged perhaps 24 words beyond basic pleasantries. But that morning, she received a call that made her blood run cold. Sophie's daycare was closing immediately due to a failed health inspection. The director was sorry, so sorry, but all the children needed to be picked up within the hour, and the facility wouldn't be reopening. Elena's hands shook as she hung up the phone. She had no family in New York, no backup plan, and no way to afford the other daycares she'd researched, all of which had waiting lists months long anyway. She stood in Alexander's kitchen, fighting back tears, trying to calculate the impossible mathematics of single parenthood. If she left work to get Sophie, she might lose this job. If she didn't get Sophie, her daughter would be sent to emergency services. She made the only choice a mother could make. She found Alexander in his study, practicing a presentation for a merger that would make headlines. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely steady. "I have a family emergency. I need to leave immediately." "I'm so sorry." He looked up, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Is everything all right?" he asked, and was surprised to find he genuinely wanted to know. "My daughter's daycare, they've closed. I have to pick her up. I'll make up the hours, I promise. I just..." "Go," he said immediately. "Family comes first." She nodded gratefully and rushed out, leaving Alexander staring at the empty doorway. He hadn't known Elena had a daughter. He hadn't known anything about her at all. Elena returned 2 hours later, and Alexander heard something he'd never heard in his apartment before, a child's laughter. He emerged from his study to find Elena kneeling in the entryway, trying to simultaneously remove her coat, comfort a small girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, and apologize profusely. "Mr. Morrison, I'm so sorry. I had nowhere else to take her. I'll keep her quiet, I promise, and I'll work extra hours to make up for any..." "Elena," he interrupted gently. "It's fine." And that's when he saw her. Sophie Rodriguez was 3 years old, with dark curls that bounced when she moved and eyes that held the kind of wonder that Alexander had forgotten existed. She peeked at him from behind her mother's legs, one small hand gripping Elena's jeans. "Hi," Sophie whispered. Something in Alexander's chest cracked open. "Hello," he replied, crouching down to her level. "What's your friend's name?" He nodded at the rabbit. Sophie looked at her mother for permission, then back at Alexander. "Mr. Hops. He likes carrots." "Does he? I think I might have some carrots in the kitchen." "Would Mr. Hops like a snack?" Sophie's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire city. Elena looked at Alexander with such surprise and gratitude that he felt embarrassed by how little kindness it took to earn it. That day, Sophie sat at Alexander's kitchen island, carefully feeding baby carrots to Mr. Hops, while Elena worked twice as fast as usual, trying to prove this wouldn't be a problem. Alexander found himself drifting back to the kitchen more often than necessary, drawn by the sound of Sophie's chatter. She told Mr. Hops elaborate stories about brave rabbits who rescued princesses and fought dragons made of broccoli. When Elena finally prepared to leave, Sophie looked up at Alexander with those impossibly wide eyes and said, "Thank you for the carrots, Mr. Morrison." He smiled. "You can call me Alex." Over the next week, Sophie became a fixture in Alexander's apartment. Elena desperately searched for new childcare, but everything was either unaffordable or unavailable. Alexander told her it was fine, that Sophie could stay, but he could see the stress etching lines around Elena's eyes. She was a proud woman, and accepting charity clearly tore at her. But Sophie was oblivious to the adult anxieties swirling around her. She brought her coloring books and crayons and sat at the kitchen table, creating masterpieces she insisted on showing Mr. Alex. She taught him the proper way to have a tea party with stuffed animals. She asked him questions about everything. Why was the sky blue? Where did clouds go at night? Did he think Mr. Hops would like a brother? Alexander found himself rearranging his schedule to be home more. He'd take conference calls while Sophie colored quietly nearby. He'd eat lunch at the kitchen island instead of his desk, listening to her narrate the adventures of Mr. Hops. He bought juice boxes and string cheese and animal crackers, items that had never before existed in his minimalist, adult world. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday, 2 weeks after Sophie had first entered his life. Alexander had a dinner meeting with Japanese investors, the kind of obligation he couldn't cancel. Elena apologized profusely, promised she'd have Sophie out of his way before he returned. But when Alexander walked through his door at 10 o'clock that night, Sophie was still there, curled up on his couch in her pajamas, fighting sleep while Elena cleaned the kitchen. The moment Sophie saw him, she scrambled off the couch and ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his legs. "You came back," she exclaimed, as if his return was the best thing that had happened all day. "Of course I came back," he said, surprised by how good it felt to be welcomed home. "This is where I live." Sophie looked up at him with sudden seriousness, her small face contemplative in a way that seemed far too old for 3 years. And then she asked the question that would shatter and rebuild Alexander's world. "Mr. Alex, will you pretend to my daddy? Just for tonight? Mama read me a book about a girl who has a daddy, and I want to know what that's like." The apartment fell absolutely silent. Alexander felt his heart stop. He looked at Elena, who had gone pale, her hands frozen on the dish she'd been washing. "Sophie, honey, you can't," Elena started, her voice thick with mortification. But Alexander held up a hand. He knelt down, looking into Sophie's hopeful eyes, and realized he was standing at a crossroads he hadn't seen coming. "What does a daddy do?" he asked softly. Sophie thought hard. "In the book, he reads bedtime stories. And he gives hugs. And he says, 'I love you, sweet girl,' before bed." Alexander felt something break and heal simultaneously inside his chest. He'd spent 32 years building walls around his heart, and this tiny girl with a stuffed rabbit had just reduced them to rubble with a single, innocent request. "Okay," he whispered. "Just for tonight." Sophie's smile was like sunrise breaking over his carefully controlled life. She grabbed his hand with complete trust, leading him toward the couch where her book waited. Elena stood in the kitchen, tears streaming silently down her face, watching this billionaire, this man who had everything except what mattered, settle onto his designer couch with her daughter curled against his side. Alexander read the story about the little girl and her daddy. His voice was rough at first, unpracticed at this kind of tenderness, but Sophie didn't seem to notice. She just snuggled closer, her small hand resting on his chest, right over his heart. When he finished the book, she looked up at him with drowsy eyes and said, "Now the hug?" He wrapped his arms around her, this small human who had asked him for the simplest and most profound thing in the world, to be seen, to be loved, to matter. "I love you, sweet girl," he whispered, the words foreign on his tongue but somehow right. "I love you too, Daddy," Sophie murmured, already half asleep. And Alexander Morrison, billionaire, titan of industry, man who had everything and nothing, felt tears slip down his face for the first time in 20 years. The morning after Sophie called him Daddy for the first time, Alexander woke up different. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying that small voice saying, "I love you too, Daddy," on an endless loop. He'd meant it to be just for that one night, a kindness to a child who wanted to experience something she'd never had. But when he walked into his kitchen and found Sophie already there, sitting at the island with her cereal and chattering to Mr. Hops, she looked up and said, "Morning, Daddy," with such natural joy that correcting her seemed cruel. Elena was mortified. "Sophie, honey, remember what we talked about? Mr. Morrison has been very kind, but he's not." "It's okay," Alexander interrupted, surprising himself. He met Elena's eyes, seeing the confusion and worry there. "We can talk later, but for now, it's okay." What Alexander couldn't articulate yet was that Sophie's simple request had opened something inside him he'd been trying to seal shut since his own father's death. Harrison Morrison had been a titan of industry, but a ghost of a parent, always absent, always working, always sacrificing family for empire. Alexander had sworn he'd never become his father, then spent the last 5 years doing exactly that. He'd buried himself in work, avoided relationships, and built a life of spectacular isolation. Sophie's innocent plea had held up a mirror to that emptiness, and he didn't like what he saw. Over the weekend, Alexander did something unprecedented. He cleared his schedule. No calls, no emails, no meetings. When Elena arrived Monday morning, prepared to work while Sophie entertained herself quietly in a corner, she found Alexander in jeans and a sweater, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "I thought we could take Sophie to the park," he said, as if billionaires regularly spent Monday mornings at playgrounds. "If that's okay with you." Elena stared. "Mr. Morrison, you don't have to." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "Or Alex. And I want to." "When's the last time you had a day off?" She couldn't remember. Between work and Sophie and the endless grind of bills and logistics, leisure was a luxury she couldn't afford. Alexander saw her hesitation and pressed his advantage. "Please, Elena, let me do this. For Sophie." He paused, then added more quietly, "For all of us." Central Park in November was a revelation of gold and crimson leaves, cool air, and surprisingly few crowds on a weekday morning. Sophie ran ahead to the playground. Mr. Hops clutched under her arm, while Alexander and Elena followed at a slower pace. For the first time, they actually talked, not employer to employee but person to person. Elena told him about growing up in Arizona, about coming to New York with dreams of becoming a teacher, about meeting Sophie's father at a restaurant where she'd been waitressing. She told him about the pregnancy, the abandonment, the impossible choice between her dreams and her daughter. "There was no choice, really," she said, watching Sophie navigate the climbing structure with fierce concentration. "The moment I knew about her, she became my whole world. I'd give up anything for her." Alexander heard the unspoken grief in those words, the career that never was, the education cut short, The youth spent struggling instead of exploring. He felt ashamed of his own complaints about the burden of wealth and responsibility. "You're an amazing mother," he said, and meant it. Elena smiled sadly. "I'm a tired mother, a broke mother, a mother who can't give her daughter the stability she deserves." She paused, then added, "That thing she asked you about pretending to be her father. I'm so sorry. She sees other kids with dads at the park, at daycare, and she doesn't understand why she doesn't have one." I try to explain, but how do you tell a 3-year-old that her father didn't want her? The pain in Elena's voice made Alexander's chest ache. "You don't have to apologize. What she asked me, it was honest. Pure. She just wanted to know what love feels like from someone who's supposed to protect her." "You were kind to play along." Alexander watched Sophie, who had spotted them and was waving frantically, shouting, "Daddy, watch this," before attempting to go down the slide backwards. His heart stuttered at the word. "What if I wasn't playing?" he said quietly. Elena turned to look at him sharply. "What? What if?" He struggled to articulate feelings that were still forming. "What if I want to be more than her employer? More than a temporary pretend father? What if I want to be present in both your lives?" Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, you can't just decide to be someone's father because you feel sorry for them. Sophie's not a charity case, and neither am I. We've been doing fine on our own." "Have you?" he challenged gently. "Elena, I see how exhausted you are. I see how you skip lunch so you can save money. I see how you worry every single day about whether you're giving Sophie enough. And I see Sophie, who is brilliant and funny and deserves the world, asking a stranger to pretend to be her father because she's missing something fundamental. So, what are you suggesting?" Elena asked, her voice defensive. "That you swoop in and save us? That you throw money at the problem and we're supposed to be grateful?" "No," Alexander said firmly. "I'm suggesting that maybe all 3 of us are missing something. You need help. Sophie needs stability. And he took a breath, admitting the truth he'd been avoiding. I need purpose. I need to matter to someone beyond a stock price. When Sophie asked me to pretend to be her father, something clicked into place that I didn't know was missing. I felt needed. Not for my money or my connections or my name, but for me. Just me." Elena searched his face, looking for the angle, the ulterior motive. Years of struggling alone had taught her that kindness always came with a price. But all she saw in Alexander's eyes was sincerity and a loneliness that matched her own. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Probably," he agreed. "But what if we tried it anyway? What if you and Sophie moved into my guest house?" He held up a hand as she started to protest. "As my employees, with proper contracts and boundaries. You'd have your own space, your privacy, but Sophie would have stability. You could finish your teaching degree if you wanted. And I could learn what it means to be there for people who need me." "Why?" Elena asked, tears spilling over. "Why would you do this for us?" Alexander looked at Sophie, who was now making snow angels in a pile of leaves, her laughter bright and clear. "Because that little girl asked me for the simplest thing in the world, to feel loved by a father. And I realized I've been asking the same question my whole life. My father gave me everything except himself. He died when I was 27, and I never really knew him. I don't want to wake up at 50 and realize I've spent my whole life being Harrison Morrison's son instead of being someone who mattered to someone." He turned back to Elena. "I'm not saying this would be easy. I'm not saying I know what I'm doing, but I'm saying I want to try. Let me try. Please." Elena looked at this man, this billionaire who could have anything he wanted, and saw something she recognized, someone who was lost, searching for meaning in all the wrong places, until a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit showed him what mattered. "We'd need rules," she said slowly, hope and fear warring in her voice. "Boundaries. This can't be about money or obligation. If you're going to be in Sophie's life, you're in it completely. You can't change your mind in 6 months when the novelty wears off and you remember you have board meetings and charity galas." I understand, Alexander said solemnly. And you can't try to replace her father. You'd have to earn that title. Every single day. I know. She'll break your things. She'll wake you up at 6 in the morning. She'll ask you 10,000 questions and want you to watch her do the same cartwheel 50 times in a row. Alexander smiled. I'm counting on it. Elena wiped her tears and called out, Sophie, honey, come here for a minute. Sophie ran over, leaves stuck in her hair, cheeks flushed from playing. What, Mama? Elena knelt down, brushing leaves from her daughter's curls. How would you feel about living in a new place? A bigger place, where you could have your own room and Mr. Alex would be around more? Sophie's eyes went wide. Would Mr. Hops get his own room too? Alexander laughed, a sound that felt rusty but good. Mr. Hops can have whatever he wants. And would you still be my pretend daddy? Sophie asked him seriously. Alexander knelt down beside Elena, looking into Sophie's trusting eyes. How about we make it not pretend? How about I try to be your real daddy? I might not be very good at it at first because I've never been a daddy before, but I promise to try my best every single day. Sophie considered this with the gravity of someone making a life-altering decision. Then she threw her arms around Alexander's neck and said, Okay, but you have to learn the tea party rules. Mr. Hops is very serious about tea parties. And just like that, Alexander Morrison's carefully constructed life was torn down and rebuilt around a 3-year-old's tea party rules and a single mother's cautious hope. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Alexander had his lawyers draw up contracts that made Elena his official household manager, with a salary that made her gasp, while she and Sophie moved into the guest house on his property, a 3-bedroom cottage that was nicer than anywhere Elena had ever lived. He hired a team to convert 1 bedroom into a princess paradise for Sophie, complete with bookshelves for her growing library and a special shelf for Mr. Hops. But more than the material changes, there were the small moments that rewrote their lives. Alexander learned to French braid hair after watching YouTube videos at midnight. He rearranged his schedule to have breakfast with Sophie every morning. He discovered that he actually enjoyed reading picture books about dancing hippos and brave little engines. Elena watched, waiting for the cracks to show, for Alexander to remember he was a billionaire with better things to do. But instead, she saw him change. He smiled more. He laughed at Sophie's terrible knock-knock jokes. He sat through 45-minute concerts where Sophie banged on toy drums and sang off-key. One evening, 3 weeks after they'd moved in, Elena found Alexander in Sophie's room, reading her a bedtime story. Sophie was already asleep, but he kept reading anyway, his voice soft and gentle. When he noticed Elena in the doorway, he carefully marked the page and tucked Sophie in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She fell asleep 10 minutes ago, Elena whispered as they stepped into the hallway. You didn't have to keep reading. Alexander smiled. I know, but I wanted to finish the story. I needed to know if the caterpillar became a butterfly. Elena laughed softly, and for the first time since Sophie's father left, she felt something uncurl in her chest, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something real in the most unexpected place. Thank you, she said quietly, for all of this, for seeing us. Alexander reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. Thank you for letting me in. I didn't know how empty my life was until it got filled with tea parties and picture books and a little girl who calls me daddy like I've earned it. You have, Elena said, meaning it. Every single day you earn it. They stood in the hallway outside Sophie's room, the silence comfortable, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. But it was there, growing between them like a garden that had been planted in darkness and was finally reaching toward light. If someone had told Alexander Morrison 6 months ago that he'd be standing in a toy store on a Saturday morning, debating the relative merits of different dollhouses with a 3-year-old girl, he would have had them evaluated for mental competence. Yet here he was, watching Sophie explain with utmost seriousness why the Victorian dollhouse was superior to the modern one because princesses need towers, Daddy. The Victorian it is, he agreed, ignoring the four-figure price tag that made the sales clerk's eyes widen. What was the point of money if he couldn't see Sophie's face light up like Christmas morning? Elena appeared around the corner, having been searching for educational puzzles, and stopped short at the sight of the elaborate dollhouse. Alexander, no. That's too expensive. It's her birthday present, he said, though Sophie's birthday wasn't for another 2 months. Her birthday is in January. It's November. Early birthday present. Elena put her hands on her hips, a gesture Sophie had unconsciously started copying.
We talked about this.
You can't just buy her everything she looks at. She needs to understand the value of. The value of what, exactly? Alexander interrupted gently. Elena, I know you're worried about spoiling her. But I grew up with everything money could buy, and nothing that mattered. I know the difference. This isn't about the dollhouse. It's about seeing her happy and knowing I helped put that happiness there. Elena's frustration softened. This was the tightrope they'd been walking for weeks. Alexander's desire to give them everything warring with Elena's need to raise her daughter with values that transcended wealth. They had variations of this argument over shoes, books, art supplies, and a ridiculously elaborate play kitchen. One dollhouse, Elena conceded. But she needs to understand it's special, not just another Tuesday. Alexander smiled. Agreed. Sophie, this is a very special gift. What do we say? Sophie, who had been watching the negotiation with wide eyes, wrapped her arms around Alexander's legs.
Thank you, Daddy.
Then, running to Elena, thank you, Mama, for letting Daddy be extra. Elena laughed despite herself. Daddy is very extra, she agreed, meeting Alexander's eyes over Sophie's head with a warmth that made his heart skip. These small moments had become the fabric of their new life. Alexander had restructured his entire existence around Sophie's schedule. He took meetings from home when possible, delegated more to his executive team, and discovered that the company didn't actually collapse if he wasn't personally overseeing every decision. He coached Sophie's tiny tot soccer team, despite knowing absolutely nothing about soccer. He learned to cook simple meals because Sophie liked helping, even though they had a chef available. He read parenting books with the same intensity he'd once reserved for market analyses.
But it wasn't just about Sophie.
Elena had enrolled in online teaching courses, studying in the evenings while Alexander did bedtime duty. He'd catch her sometimes, curled up on the couch with her laptop and a cup of tea, completely absorbed in educational theory, and feel a surge of pride. She was brilliant, and watching her reclaim her dreams made him want to be better, do better. Their relationship remained carefully platonic. Elena still worked for Alexander, still insisted on maintaining professional boundaries even as they navigated the intimate dance of co-parenting. She had her own space in the guest house, her own life, her own independence. But there were moments, hands brushing when they both reached for Sophie's backpack, eyes meeting over Sophie's head during a particularly amusing meltdown, late-night conversations after Sophie was asleep, when the boundaries felt less like protection and more like prison. The real test came in December, when Alexander's mother, Catherine Morrison, announced she was coming for her annual Christmas visit. Catherine was old money New England, a woman who considered emotions vulgar and viewed life through the lens of social standing and proprietary. Alexander had been dreading telling her about Elena and Sophie, knowing his mother would have opinions, none of them supportive. She's going to hate me, Elena said when Alexander finally confessed his mother was coming. They were decorating the Christmas tree, Sophie allegedly helping but mostly hanging all the ornaments on one low branch. She doesn't hate anyone, Alexander said. She merely disapproves with extreme prejudice. That's so much better, Elena muttered. Alexander caught her hand.
Hey.
You and Sophie are part of my life now. An important part. My mother will adjust, because she'll have to. And if she can't be respectful, she can stay at a hotel. Elena searched his face. You'd really choose us over your mother's approval? Without hesitation, he said firmly. You and Sophie aren't temporary, Elena. You're not an experiment or a phase. You're everything. The weight of those words hung between them, heavy with implication neither was quite ready to address. Sophie broke the moment by announcing that Mr. Hops needed a ornament too, launching a search for rabbit-appropriate Christmas decorations. Catherine Morrison arrived on December 20th in a town car, wearing Chanel and judgment in equal measure. She swept into Alexander's penthouse with the air of a general inspecting troops and stopped short when she saw the evidence of child habitation, toys in the corner, juice boxes in the previously pristine fridge, and a gallery of Sophie's artwork hung with magnets on the stainless steel refrigerator. Alexander, she said coolly, you mentioned changes, but didn't specify you'd turned your home into a daycare. Mother, I'd like you to meet Elena Rodriguez and her daughter Sophie. Alexander's hand rested protectively on Sophie's shoulder. They're living in the guest house. Elena manages my household, and Sophie is my daughter. In all the ways that matter. Catherine's expression could have frozen the Hudson. I see. And how long has this arrangement been in place? 2 months, Elena said, stepping forward with her chin raised. And before you ask, no, Alexander and I aren't romantically involved. I work for him, but he's been incredibly kind to my daughter, and I won't apologize for accepting help when it was offered. Catherine studied Elena with the intensity of a jeweler examining a potentially flawed diamond. You're very direct. I can't afford not to be, Mrs. Morrison. I don't come from your world. I'm a single mother who cleans houses and takes night classes. But I love my daughter, I work hard, and I don't take advantage of people's kindness. Something flickered in Catherine's eyes. Respect, maybe, or at least a recalibration. Before she could respond, Sophie tugged on Catherine's coat. Are you Daddy's mommy? Sophie asked with the fearless curiosity of 3-year-olds everywhere. Catherine looked down at this small person with wild curls and paint-stained overalls. I suppose I am. Then you're my grandma, Sophie announced with delighted logic. Do you want to meet Mr. Hops? He's a very important rabbit. Alexander held his breath. His mother had never been warm, never been the cookie-baking, grandchild-spoiling type. He prepared to intervene, to protect Sophie from Catherine's inevitable cold dismissal. But Catherine surprised him. She looked at Sophie for a long moment, and something in her carefully maintained expression cracked. She knelt down, her expensive coat pooling on the floor, and said, I would be honored to meet Mr. Hops. Sophie grabbed Catherine's hand and led her to the couch, chattering about Mr. Hops' preferences in tea and his opinions on cookies. Alexander and Elena stood frozen, watching this impossible scene. Catherine Morrison, Ice Queen of Manhattan society, being lectured on proper tea party etiquette by a 3-year-old. Later that evening, after Sophie was in bed, Catherine sat with Alexander and Elena in the living room, nursing a scotch. You've changed, she said to Alexander. You're softer, happier. Is that bad? He asked carefully. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Your father and we raised you in a specific way. We thought preparation for the business world meant eliminating weakness, which we defined as emotion. I watched you turn into a carbon copy of Harrison, and I told myself that's what we wanted. She looked into her glass. But Harrison died alone in his office, surrounded by contracts and stock reports. No one was holding his hand. No one was telling him they loved him. He had everything and nothing. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't want that for you, Alexander. I thought I did, but watching you with that little girl, seeing you choose love over appearance, it's the bravest thing I've ever seen you do. Alexander felt his throat tighten. I'm not brave, Mother. I'm terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing. None of us do, Catherine said. But you're trying, and that's what matters. She turned to Elena. You're good for him. You and your daughter. You've given him something I never could, permission to be human. Elena reached over and squeezed Catherine's hand. He's given us something too.
Hope. Stability.
A father for Sophie who chose her, who wants her, who shows up every single day. Then we're all lucky, Catherine said simply. The next morning, Alexander woke to find Catherine in the kitchen making pancakes, an activity he'd never witnessed in his entire life, while Sophie supervised and offered questionable cooking advice. Elena stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. What's wrong? Alexander whispered, coming up beside her. Nothing's wrong, Elena said. Everything's right. That's what's terrifying me. This happiness, this family feeling, what happens when it ends? Alexander turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. What if it doesn't end? What if this is just the beginning? Alexander, she started, but he pressed a finger to her lips. I know we've kept this professional. I know you need independence and boundaries. But Elena, I'm falling in love with you. Not just with Sophie, though I love her completely. With you. Your strength, your integrity, the way you fight for what matters. The way you've rebuilt your life piece by piece. The way you make me want to be better. Elena closed her eyes, tears slipping free. You're my employer. You hold all the power. How can I trust that this is real and not just proximity, gratitude, circumstance? Because I'd give up all the power if it meant you'd trust this, Alexander said fiercely. I'll tear up your employment contract. I'll set up a trust for Sophie that's irrevocable, that guarantees her future regardless of what happens between us. I'll give you the guest house outright. I'll do whatever it takes to prove this isn't about power or control. It's about love. Elena opened her eyes, searching his face. What if I break your heart? Then I'll have had my heart broken by the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, and it will have been worth it. What if? He kissed her, gently at first, then deeper when she melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena laughed shakily. I was going to list about 15 more what-ifs. We'll figure them out, Alexander promised. Together. If you want to. From the kitchen, Sophie's voice rang out. Grandma, I think the pancake is burning. Catherine's uncharacteristically flustered response sent Elena and Alexander into laughter. They walked into the kitchen hand in hand to find Catherine waving a dish towel at a smoking pan, while Sophie provided commentary. Daddy, Grandma needs cooking lessons, Sophie announced. Can you teach her? Alexander looked around at this impossible scene, his mother, flustered and smiling, Elena, radiant and hopeful, Sophie, the catalyst for everything, and felt a happiness so profound it was almost painful. I think we all need to learn some things, he said, pulling Elena close and lifting Sophie into his arms. But we'll figure it out together. Like a family. Sophie beamed. The best family. Right, Mr. Hops? And somewhere, a stuffed rabbit who had witnessed the whole transformation seemed to agree. January arrived with snow and Sophie's 4th birthday, and Alexander approached the occasion with the seriousness of a military campaign. He'd been secretly planning for weeks, collaborating with Elena on a party that would be special without being obscenely extravagant, a balance he was still learning to strike. 12 kids, Alexander. Not 50. Elena had reminded him when he'd suggested renting out an entire children's museum. She's 4. She wants cake, friends, and maybe a princess. So he'd compromised. A party at their home with Sophie's small circle of friends from her new preschool, a princess-themed treasure hunt, and a special surprise he'd kept even from Elena. But the week before Sophie's birthday, everything threatened to unravel. Alexander's company faced a crisis, a hostile takeover attempt by a rival corporation that required his immediate and undivided attention. The timing couldn't have been worse. Board meetings stretched into the early morning hours. Conference calls consumed his days. The merger that had seemed simple in October now teetered on the edge of disaster, and the board was pressuring Alexander to fly to Tokyo for emergency negotiations. The meetings are during Sophie's birthday, Alexander told his CFO flatly during a video conference. I'm not going. Alexander, this is a multi-billion-dollar deal, James Reynolds said carefully. If we lose this because you won't, then we lose it, Alexander interrupted. I've spent my entire adult life sacrificing everything for this company. I've missed weddings, funerals, and every major life event you can imagine because Morrison Industries came first. But I have a daughter now, and I promised her I'd be at her birthday party. I'm not breaking that promise. The silence on the call was deafening. Finally, James spoke. You've really changed. I've finally figured out what matters, Alexander corrected. Restructure the meetings. I'll do whatever needs to be done remotely, but I'm not leaving my daughter on her birthday. He ended the call and found Elena standing in the doorway, having heard everything. You'd really risk the company for a 4-year-old's birthday party? She asked softly. It's not just a party, Elena. It's a promise. It's showing Sophie that when I say she matters, I mean it. Actions over words, right? That's what you taught me. Elena crossed the room and kissed him, deep and sure. They'd been officially together for 3 weeks now, navigating the strange waters of transforming from employer-employee to partners, and every day Alexander fell more in love with her. You're going to be an amazing father, Elena whispered against his lips. I'm trying to be worthy of you both. Sophie's birthday dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline January day that made the city sparkle. The house filled with children's laughter as Sophie's friends arrived, and Alexander found himself simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated by the chaos of a dozen 4-year-olds hyped up on cake and excitement. He'd arranged for a princess performer, thinking Sophie would enjoy the spectacle. But when the woman arrived in full Cinderella regalia, Sophie took one look and ran to Alexander, burying her face in his legs. Hey, what's wrong, sweetheart? He asked, kneeling down. She's not a real princess, Sophie whispered, tears in her eyes. I thought. Mama said a princess was coming. Alexander's heart broke at the disappointment in her voice. He looked up at Elena, who shrugged helplessly. They'd both thought Sophie would enjoy the pretend. Then Alexander had an idea. He stood up, pulled out his phone, and made a call he'd been contemplating for weeks. 20 minutes later, a woman arrived who made every jaw in the room drop, including Elena's. Victoria Chin wasn't a hired princess. She was royalty of a different sort, the prima ballerina of the New York City Ballet, one of the most famous dancers in the world, and someone who happened to owe Alexander a favor after he'd anonymously funded the ballet's new children's program. Victoria swept into the room in jeans and a sweater, but she carried herself with such grace that she might as well have been wearing a crown. She knelt down to Sophie's level. I hear there's a birthday girl here who loves dancing, Victoria said in her gentle, accented English. Sophie's eyes went wide. You're a real ballerina? I am. And you know what? Ballerinas are better than princesses because we work hard for our magic. Would you like to learn some ballet? For the next hour, Victoria taught a dozen 4-year-olds basic ballet positions, turning Alexander's living room into an impromptu dance studio. She was patient, kind, and absolutely genuine, everything the hired princess hadn't been. Sophie glowed with happiness, and when Victoria presented her with a signed pair of ballet slippers and an invitation to attend a real ballet performance, Sophie threw her arms around the famous dancer and said, "This is the best birthday ever." After the party wound down and the last guest departed, Elena found Alexander in the kitchen, doing dishes while Victoria chatted with Catherine, who had stayed for the party and become unexpectedly charming with the children. You called in a prima ballerina for a 4-year-old's birthday party, Elena said, still processing. I called in a favor for my daughter, Alexander corrected. There's a difference. Alexander, These kinds of connections, this kind of life, sometimes I still can't believe this is real. That we're real. He dried his hands and pulled her close. I need to tell you something. I've been working with my lawyers on paperwork. Adoption paperwork. For Sophie. Elena froze. What? I want to legally adopt her. Not to take her away from you. Not to have power over you. But to make official what's already true in my heart. That she's my daughter. That I choose her, legally and permanently, regardless of what happens between you and me. Tears streamed down Elena's face. You want to adopt her? I want her to have my name if she wants it. I want legal rights to make medical decisions if needed. I want her to inherit, to be protected, to never wonder if my commitment is real. And I want, he took a breath, I want us to be a family. All three of us. Legally, officially, permanently. He pulled out a small box from his pocket, and Elena's breath caught. I know this is fast, Alexander said, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring. I know we've only been officially together for a few weeks, but I've spent the last 3 months falling in love with you and Sophie, building a life that actually means something. I don't need more time to know that I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I don't need more evidence that you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. He knelt down, taking her hand. Elena Rodriguez, will you marry me? Will you let me be your partner, Sophie's father, and the man who gets to love you both forever? Elena was crying too hard to speak. She nodded, then found her voice.
Yes. God, yes.
But Alexander, I need you to understand. I'm not marrying you for your money, or your name, or any of this. She gestured at the penthouse. I'm marrying you because you read bedtime stories with silly voices. Because you learned to braid hair from YouTube videos. Because you gave up a $1 billion deal in Tokyo to be at a 4-year-old's birthday party. I'm marrying you because you chose us when you could have had anything. I chose you because you are everything, Alexander said, sliding the ring onto her finger. You and Sophie. You're the best decision I've ever made. They kissed, deep and sweet, until a small voice said, Are you guys being mushy? They broke apart to find Sophie standing in the doorway, Mr. Hops under her arm, looking suspicious. Very mushy, Alexander admitted, pulling her into their embrace. Hey, Sophie, I want to ask you something important. Sophie looked at him seriously. Okay. How would you feel if I adopted you? That means I'd legally be your daddy, and you could have my last name if you wanted it. You'd be Sophie Morrison. Or you could keep Rodriguez. Or you could be Sophie Rodriguez Morrison. Whatever you want. Sophie thought about this with the gravity of someone making a life-altering decision. Would Mr. Hops be Mr. Hops Morrison? Alexander laughed. Absolutely. The whole family, including Mr. Hops. And you'd be my daddy forever? Not just pretend. Forever. I promise. Sophie threw her arms around his neck. Okay. But can I still call you daddy? Not father or dad, just daddy? I wouldn't want it any other way. Catherine appeared in the doorway, having overheard everything. If we're making this official, I insist on planning the wedding. And before you protest, Elena, I promise to respect your wishes. But every Morrison bride deserves a proper celebration. Elena laughed through her tears. I think I can live with that. The next few months were a blur of legal paperwork, wedding planning, and the continued navigation of building a blended family. Alexander's adoption of Sophie was finalized in March, and the day the judge declared him her legal father, Sophie insisted on bringing Mr. Hops to court to witness the occasion. Mr. Hops needs to know it's official, she explained seriously. The wedding took place in April, a small ceremony in the garden of Alexander's estate with only close friends and family. Sophie was the flower girl, taking her duties so seriously that she meticulously placed each petal in a perfect line down the aisle. When Elena walked toward Alexander, he saw his entire future in her eyes, not the empire he'd built, not the fortune he'd amassed, but the love they'd chosen to create together. His vows were simple. Elena, you and Sophie walked into my life when I was rich in everything except what mattered. You taught me that love isn't something you schedule or delegate or manage. It's something you live every single day. You taught me that being a father isn't about genetics or obligation, but about showing up, being present, and choosing love over convenience. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of the gift you've given me, the gift of being needed, being loved, and being part of something bigger than myself. Elena's vows made even Catherine cry. Alexander, when my daughter asked you to pretend to be her father, you could have said no. You could have been kind, but distant. Instead, you opened your heart and your life, and you gave us something we'd stopped believing in, a family. You've shown me that strength isn't about doing everything alone, that accepting help isn't weakness, and that love can come from the most unexpected places. I promise to spend the rest of my life building this life we've created, honoring the trust you've placed in us, and loving you with everything I have. When the minister pronounced them married, Sophie shouted, "Now you have to kiss," sending the small gathering into laughter. At the reception, Alexander danced with Sophie, her small feet standing on his shoes as they swayed to music. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him with those eyes that had changed his world. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for being my real daddy, not my pretend one." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for teaching me how to be one." As he looked around the garden at Elena laughing with Victoria and Catherine, at his board members who'd flown in to witness this impossible transformation, at Sophie beaming with the joy of a child who knew she was loved, Alexander Morrison realized something profound. He'd spent 32 years building an empire, and it had taken a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit to teach him what it meant to be truly rich. 5 years later, Alexander stood in the doorway of Sophie's room, watching her practice pirouettes with the fierce concentration of an 8-year-old determined to perfect her art. The room had evolved from Princess Paradise to a hybrid of ballet studio and budding scientist's laboratory. Sophie had discovered a passion for both dance and marine biology, declaring that she wanted to be a dancing oceanographer. One more spin and then homework, Elena called from down the hallway, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd learned to balance indulgence with discipline. Sophie groaned but complied, finishing her practice with a flourish before grabbing her backpack. She paused to kiss Mr. Hops, who had a permanent place of honor on her bed despite being ratty and repaired in several places. "Daddy, can you help me with my math?" Sophie asked, appearing at Alexander's side. "It's fractions, and they're weird." "Fractions are not weird, they're beautiful," Alexander said, leading her to the kitchen table where these moments of homework help had become sacred routine. "They're like cutting a cake into equal pieces." "But why can't we just eat the whole cake?" Sophie asked with 8-year-old logic. "Because then we wouldn't have any to share with your brother," Elena said, emerging from the nursery with 2-year-old James in her arms. James Morrison had arrived 18 months ago, a planned addition to their family who had Sophie's dark curls but Alexander's gray eyes. Sophie had taken to big sisterhood with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything, though she'd initially been concerned that a brother wouldn't appreciate Mr. Hops the way a sister might. "Mr. Hops is gender-inclusive," Alexander had assured her solemnly, earning a laugh from Elena. Now, as Alexander helped Sophie navigate the mysterious world of fractions while Elena prepared dinner and James destroyed a tower of blocks with gleeful abandon, Alexander felt the same profound gratitude that struck him at odd moments. Gratitude for the day Sophie had asked him to pretend to be her father. Gratitude for Elena's courage in letting him into their lives. Gratitude for the family they'd built together. His phone buzzed with what was probably the 50th message about the Morrison Foundation's latest initiative. After Sophie's adoption, Alexander had restructured his entire approach to wealth and business. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations of Morrison Industries, installing a capable CEO while retaining chairman of the board. Instead, he'd thrown his energy into the Morrison Foundation, focused on supporting single parents, providing childcare assistance, and funding educational opportunities for children in underserved communities. "You're changing lives," his CFO had said during their last quarterly review. "Not just with money, but with actual systemic change." "I'm paying forward what was given to me," Alexander had replied. A second chance at getting life right. The foundation had become his true legacy, and Sophie was deeply involved despite her young age. She'd suggested they fund arts programs because not every kid gets to meet a real ballerina like I did. She'd asked why they didn't help kids whose parents were sick, leading to a healthcare initiative. She'd wondered if they could help animals too, inspiring an environmental education program. "Sophie's going to run the foundation one day," Elena had said, watching their daughter present a surprisingly sophisticated proposal for ocean conservation to the foundation board. "She's going to run the world," Alexander had corrected. "We're just along for the ride." Now, helping Sophie understand fractions, Alexander's mind wandered to the bigger picture. Tomorrow was the 5-year anniversary of the day Sophie had first asked him to pretend to be her father. He'd been planning a surprise for weeks, something to mark the occasion and honor the journey they'd taken together. After dinner and homework and the elaborate bedtime routine that now included both Sophie and James, Alexander finally had a moment alone with Elena. They'd converted the guest house into his office, transforming their original living space into a true family home. Now they stood on the terrace overlooking the city, Elena leaning against him as they watched the lights flicker on across Manhattan. "Do you ever miss it?" Elena asked. "The simplicity of your old life? No chaos, no plastic toys everywhere, number 2 a.m. wake-ups from a teething toddler." Alexander laughed. "Are you kidding? That wasn't simplicity, it was emptiness. I'd take the chaos of our life over that quiet any day." He paused. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, letting me into your life? Sometimes I worry that I steamrolled in and changed everything." Elena turned to face him. "Alexander, before you, I was surviving, working myself to exhaustion, struggling to give Sophie the basics, terrified every day that one wrong move would destroy the fragile stability I'd built. You didn't steamroll into my life. You opened doors I didn't know existed. You gave my daughter a father who chose her. You gave me back my dreams and added new ones I'd never imagined. No, I don't regret it. Not for a single second." He kissed her, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that still made his heart race after 5 years of marriage. "I have something for you," he said when they broke apart. "For tomorrow's anniversary. The anniversary of the day Sophie asked you to be her pretend daddy. Alexander, you don't need to. I want to. Come with me." He led her to his office, where he'd been secretly working on a project for months. On his desk sat a leather-bound book, beautifully crafted with gold embossing on the cover, The Morrison Family Story. Elena gasped as she opened it. The first page was a photo of Sophie at 3 years old, clutching Mr. Hops, her eyes wide and trusting. The second page contained the words that had changed everything. "Please pretend you're my dad." The book chronicled their entire journey, photos from their first trip to the park, Sophie's 4th birthday party with Victoria, the adoption ceremony, the wedding, James's birth. But more than photos, Alexander had written the story. Their story, in his own words, capturing the transformation from lonely billionaire and struggling single mother to the family they'd become. The final page was blank except for one sentence. "To Sophie, who taught me that the best gifts ask for nothing in return except love. And to Elena, who taught me that accepting that gift is the bravest thing you can do." Elena was crying, clutching the book to her chest. "Alexander, it's perfect. It's us. I want Sophie to have it when she's older. I want her to know that families don't always look traditional, that love isn't about biology or expectation, it's about choice. I want her to understand that when she asked me to be her pretend father, she gave me the greatest gift of my life, purpose, meaning, and a love I didn't know I was capable of." They stood there, holding each other, the book between them like a physical representation of the life they'd built. From down the hall came James's cry. He was teething again, and they laughed at the timing. "I'll get him," Alexander said. "You sit, read. Let me have this one." He walked down the hallway to James's nursery, picking up his son and settling into the rocking chair. As James quieted, soothed by Alexander's presence, Sophie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Can I sit with you?" Alexander shifted, making room for her on his lap despite James's presence. She curled against him, 8 years old but still young enough to seek comfort in her father's arms. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you remember when I asked you to pretend to be my dad?" "Every day, sweetheart. It's one of my most treasured memories. I don't remember it very well. I was little, but Mama says it changed everything."
It did.
"It changed me from someone who had everything into someone who had something worth having." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I'm glad I asked you, even though I was scared you'd say no." Alexander's heart clenched. "You were scared?" "A little. Because kids at daycare said their daddies were busy and important, and you seemed busy and important. But you said yes. You said yes, and you stayed yes, even when I was annoying or loud or broke your stuff." "Sophie Morrison," Alexander said firmly, "you are never annoying. You are brilliant and passionate and exactly perfect as you are. And I didn't stay yes because I felt obligated. I stayed yes because being your father is the greatest privilege of my life." Sophie hugged him tighter, careful not to squish James. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, sweet girl. Forever and always." The next morning, Alexander woke to Sophie jumping on the bed, an activity Elena had theoretically banned but secretly allowed on special occasions. "It's the anniversary," Sophie shouted. "The day I asked you to be my pretend daddy and you became my real daddy." "How did you know about that?" Alexander asked, laughing as James toddled in and tried to climb up too. "Mama told me. She said we're celebrating the day our family started." Elena appeared in the doorway, already dressed, holding a wrapped package. "I have something for you too," she said to Alexander. "For the man who said yes when he could have said no." Alexander opened the package to find a painting, Sophie's artwork from over the years, professionally arranged into a collage that formed a larger image, their family. The different artistic phases were all there, from toddler scribbles to more sophisticated 8-year-old drawings, but together they created something beautiful and whole. "Sophie and I have been working on this for months," Elena said. "Every piece of art tells part of our story. Look closer." Alexander examined the collage and found hidden details. Mr. Hopp's appearing in various drawings, the guest house where they'd first lived, the playground where Alexander had first agreed to Sophie's request, the courthouse where the adoption was finalized. It was their entire journey, told through a child's evolving artistic vision. "It's perfect," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you are perfect." They spent the day as a family, not at expensive restaurants or exclusive events, but at the park where it had all begun. They had a picnic, played on the playground, and Alexander pushed both kids on the swings until his arms ached. Catherine joined them, having become a surprisingly involved grandmother who regularly babysat and had opinions about everything from Sophie's ballet technique to James's eating habits. As the sun set and they packed up to leave, Sophie grabbed Alexander's hand.
"Daddy?"
"Can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart. Do you ever wish you'd said no that day? When I asked you to pretend?" Alexander knelt down, looking into his daughter's eyes, so wise for 8 years old, already showing the strength and compassion that would carry her through life. "Sophie, that day you asked me to pretend to be your father, you gave me permission to become the person I was always meant to be. You didn't know it then, but I was lost. I had money and success, and everything the world says should make you happy, but I felt empty. And then this tiny girl with a stuffed rabbit asked me for the simplest, most profound thing in the world, to be loved, and to give love in return. He pulled her into a hug. You saved me, Sophie. You taught me what matters. So no, I've never once wished I'd said no. I only wish I'd found you sooner. Sophie hugged him back fiercely. I'm glad you're my daddy. My real, forever daddy. I'm glad I'm yours too. As they walked back to the car, James holding Elena's hand and Sophie clutching Mr. Hops while chattering about her upcoming ballet recital, Alexander looked at his family. This impossible, beautiful family that had started with a little girl's brave request, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. His phone buzzed with another message about the foundation, another opportunity to change lives. He glanced at it, then silenced the phone. Work could wait. Board meetings and financial reports and philanthropic initiatives could all wait. Right now, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, walking through Central Park with his wife, his daughter, his son, and a well-loved stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hops. What are you thinking about? Elena asked, noticing his expression. I'm thinking about how different my life would be if I'd said no that day. If I'd been too busy or too uncomfortable or too afraid of what caring might cost me. What would your life look like? Elena asked gently. Alexander looked at his family, Sophie now racing ahead with James toddling after her, Catherine following with surprising agility, everyone laughing, and shook his head. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know it wouldn't have you. It wouldn't have Sophie or James or family dinners or ballet recitals or being woken up at 6 a.m. by a toddler who wants pancakes. It wouldn't have any of the things that make life worth living. Elena squeezed his hand. You know what Sophie told me last week? She said she wants to help other kids find daddies like you when she grows up. She wants to work at the foundation and match kids who need parents with people who need kids. Alexander felt tears sting his eyes. She said that.
She did.
She said everybody should have what she has, a daddy who chose her, who shows up, who loves her without conditions. She wants to give other kids that same gift. She's already changing the world, Alexander said, just like her mother. They caught up with the kids, and Sophie immediately grabbed Alexander's other hand, so he was walking with his whole family connected. Cars passed by, people rushed past on their own important errands, the city hummed with its usual chaos. But in that moment, Alexander Morrison had everything that mattered, a hand to hold, a purpose worth living for, and the absolute certainty that when a 3-year-old girl had asked him to pretend to be her father, she'd given him the greatest truth of his life. Love isn't about pretending. It's about choosing to show up, day after day, in all the messy, beautiful, ordinary moments that make a family. And Alexander had chosen to show up. 5 years ago, and every day since, and every day that would follow. That was the real gift. Not the money or the success or the empire he'd built, but the choice to say yes when a child asked to be loved, the courage to accept that love when it was offered, and the daily commitment to earn it, over and over again, through presence and care and unwavering devotion. Race you home, Sophie shouted, breaking free and running ahead. No running near the street, Elena called, even as she smiled at their daughter's endless energy. Alexander scooped up James and chased after Sophie, laughing like the child he'd never gotten to be, living the life he'd never known he wanted, grateful beyond measure for the moment a little girl had looked at him and asked for something he didn't know he had to give.
Love.
Purpose.
Family.
Home. All because he'd said yes.